All right, guys, let's go ahead and get started with this Woodrow Wilson review for your Woodrow Wilson test. Remember, this test is going to cover several things, not only with Woodrow Wilson and his domestic and foreign policy, but it's also going to cover everything United States based in World War One. Okay, so remember, Wilson will be our president throughout the entirety of the war. Okay, and make sure you feel confident not only in Wilson as a president, right, but in terms of World War One and the United States' involvement in that. Okay. Now, first things first, just remember the very first presidential election we talked about in this new unit, and that's the election of 1912. Remember, this was kind of a weird election, right? Okay, we had three parties technically that had a lot of grounding in the race. Okay, you had the Republicans, you had the Democrats, and then you had Teddy Roosevelt come in with that third party, the Bull Moose Party. Remember why he's going to come in with that Bull Moose Party is because he didn't think President Taft was progressive enough. Okay, the tariffs that Taft was doing, the laws and policies that Taft was doing to Teddy Roosevelt, he didn't feel like that was doing enough to change society in the United States. And so Teddy Roosevelt will come back and try to run for a third term under the Bull Moose Party. And remember, that kind of messes things up for the Republicans, right? Because even though Teddy Roosevelt is considering himself a third party, right, with the Bull Moose Party, okay, he's really Republican, true and true. Okay. And so what we start seeing in the election of 1912 is you have some of the Republicans over here going with Taft, and then you have the other Republicans over here going with Roosevelt. And so neither one of them, right, were able to get enough votes to win the presidency. And so that allows our Democrat, you see him here, right, Woodrow Wilson, to come in as a result of that split Republican vote. But now, one other thing to remember with these three guys is that they were all progressive, right? Taft, Roosevelt, and Wilson, your three progressive presidents. Because remember, progressivism or being a progressive wasn't tied to your political party, right? It was an idea that you believed based on whether or not you wanted to see society changed and reformed. Okay, which all three of these men did. Okay, so they were all three progressive. Weren't all three Republican, but they were all three progressive. Okay. Now, remember, Wilson's idea of progressivism centered around these ideas. Okay, he was going to look at tariffs. Okay, so he gave us the Underwood tariff. Okay, remember the only tariff you had to know this go around. Okay, remember it's going to lower it. Okay, he's going to lower it from the 37% that Taft gave us to now a 27% tariff. Okay, and so remember, Wilson being Democrat, that pretty much suited right where he wanted to be. All right, because with Democrats, they wanted to ensure we had as much money coming into the United States as possible, and decreasing tariffs allowed for that to happen, which could because we see more and more foreign countries sending in goods, which then meant they were sending in money as well. Now, one thing to also remember is that this forced American businesses to lower their prices to compete with foreign goods coming in. Now, this leads into the Clayton Antitrust Act, okay, which is kind of the predecessor of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, but now the Clayton Antitrust Act had a little more oomph behind it, right? We gave a definition to what a monopoly is and what businesses can and cannot do. And so we're going to see an official outlawing of monopolies in the United States, and we're going to ensure that there is fair competition. Okay, these businesses couldn't buy stock in each other anymore. They couldn't build each other up, okay, to form monopolies. Okay. Another area where Wilson was very serious about were child labor. All right, and he's going to pass several child labor laws, the most effective one being the Keaton-Owen Act. Okay, remember that Keaton-Owen Act is going to increase the age requirements, right? So you can't just bring in 8, 9, 10-year-old kids into mines or into factories and force them to work. But remember, this does get brought down by the Supreme Court several years after it is passed. Okay, but nevertheless, it gets deemed unconstitutional and is brought down, and we replace it with other laws. And then remember, one of the biggest attributes of Wilson's progressivism, okay, one of the things that he kind of goes down in history for, it's how he reformed the banking institutes in the United States, and that was through the Federal Reserve Act. Remember, we did that assignment in the hallway. But essentially, remember, this is the bank of all banks, right? It is the bank that regulates all American banks to where now they can't take advantage of American citizens. Okay. I remember it created the Federal Reserve Board that these 7 board members who are appointed by the president. Okay, and they are entrusted with interest rates. They are entrusted with ensuring banks are taken care of and are regulated in a way to where they cannot take advantage of Americans. Okay, but all of this was his progressivism, right? This is how he was changing society. This is how he was reforming society into a progressive manner. So take a quick second to answer practice question number 1. Now, also remember Wilson's foreign policy, right? We didn't spend near a whole lot of time on his foreign policy, but we got the gist of it. Remember, his foreign policy was moral diplomacy. Okay, so it sounds similar to the gunboat diplomacy or big stick policy, and then the dollar diplomacy of Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. But remember, it was vastly different. Hey, he didn't want to use military. He didn't want to use money. Okay, he was all about democracy, right? Giving people a say and a voice. Okay, remember, of the 3 progressive presidents, Wilson would be the only one who would have labeled himself as an anti-imperialist. Okay, and so he didn't want to go in and control all of these places, or for lack of a better way, saying he didn't want to take over any more places. He didn't want to colonize or territorialize anymore. And so, but there was one region where he still felt like he needed to have some influence. Remember, that was Latin America. Okay, and it was over that one thing called the Panama Canal that allowed us to trade easier. Now, one of the biggest countries that Wilson will do a lot of dealings with, remember, is Mexico. Okay, and so with Mexico, we removed an embargo on arms because remember, in Mexico, there were all of these revolutions happening and leaders losing power, and then other leaders coming in. And then there were some leaders who couldn't be influenced by the United States. They were trying to cause more rebellions to go against the United States. And so we started supporting pro-American leaders. And so to do that, we ended up sending them military supplies. Okay. Now, in the process of us sending them military supplies, we end up going ashore to stop other military supplies being brought into Mexico. And when that happens, remember, some of our American troops end up getting arrested, and we start demanding Mexico apologize and pledge their allegiance to the American flag, right? And then it just kind of falters from there, and Wilson realizes that he doesn't really have any other option but to send in the military to keep order and keep control. Now he sees this reaction again when we have to go after a dude named Pancho Villa, and you can see it in this political cartoon right here. Right, Uncle Sam hopping the border from the United States to Mexico, right? Pancho Villa right here. Remember, Pancho Villa had gone into the United States and ended up killing 17 Americans. And so as kind of a result of that, we ended up having to send General John J. Pershing, right, into Mexico to look for him, right? Now, we end up searching for Pancho Villa for about a year. And then we ultimately have to pull out because that we end up having to pull out because we go into World War One in 1917. Now, make sure you can label Mexico on a map. That is one of the geography questions that you'll see on your test for Wilson. Okay, so make sure you know that geography. And we'll talk more geography when we get to World War One. Okay. Now, causes of World War One. Okay. Make sure you know the long-term causes and then the short-term causes, right? The long-term causes are the easy ones, the 4: MAIN, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, right? So all of these things that didn't necessarily spark the war, right? But it led to the war happening. Okay. And so militarism, we're building up our militaries and we're glorifying military. And so that pushes people to war. Alliances, okay, one country falls right after the other. That leads to war. Okay. Imperialism, fighting over territory, leads to war. And then nationalism, right? Okay. One saying, oh, I'm better than you, vice versa. And that leads to war. right? But then the final straw and what ultimately sparks the war starting, right? Remember, is the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, right, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Right, remember, killed by a man named Gavrilo Princip. Okay, that ultimately sparks the war. Okay, starting first between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Okay, all right. So know your long-term causes and your short-term causes. Okay, and ultimately how World War One erupts. Now, remember the initial American response to the war in Europe. Okay, at first, America remains neutral. Okay, all right, Wilson is going to urge Americans to be impartial in thought as well as in action. Okay, saying that this war was no war for the United States, that it was a war in Europe. Okay, and we didn't have any dog in the fight. Okay, but remember, if we were truly neutral, okay, would we have been given loans out? Remember, by the time we entered the war in 1917, okay, we'd given loans out to our allies, we'd given loans out to Germany. Okay, but remember the difference. Okay, we'd given billions of dollars to our allies and only millions of dollars to Germany. Okay. And then on top of that, you have the National Defense Act, where we're building up our army. You have the Naval Construction Act, okay, where we were building battleships for war. All right. And so remember, he started that campaign going into the election of 1916, where he was preaching that he kept us out of war. But remember, a lot of Americans were questioning that. Okay, on did Wilson really keep us out of war, or was he preparing us for a war that he knew we would inevitably be forced into? Okay, all right. So know how we kind of first started in our response, starting 100% neutral in 1914. And as time went on, right, we saw that slowly going away. Now, remember, for the United States, we had several steps that led us to war. All right, first and foremost, you have the German unrestricted submarine warfare, starting with the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. Okay, remember, we hadn't cared really before, okay, that these German U-boats were sinking ships until the Lusitania, when 128 Americans end up being killed along with it. Okay, right, and that leads to one thing after the other. Germany gives the Sussex Pledge, when they promise that they won't sink any more ships, and we know that that goes away soon after. Now, with Germany, make sure you know where that is on a map as well. Okay, as well as the Allies. Okay, Russia, the United States, France, Great Britain. Okay, know where these places are on the map. Okay. Now, also with Russia, remember, we have the Bolshevik Revolution, okay, led by Vladimir Lenin. Okay, and what this does, remember, is essentially start a civil war within Russia. Okay, and it forces them to remove themselves from the war. Okay, and we lose an allied power. Okay, and so that is one big reason that the United States starts to question, should we enter this war? All right, and then you have the Zimmerman telegram. Okay, all right, remember, the Zimmerman telegram was a message from Germany to Mexico, right, telling Mexico that if the United States declares war on Germany, then Germany should step in and declare war on the United States, right? And when Germany wins, okay, then Mexico would gain Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Okay. Now, remember, the British intercept this telegram and get it to the United States. And so this, on top of us losing an allied power in Russia, okay, Wilson goes to Congress and starts asking them to declare war, okay, for the reason you see there, to make the world safe for democracy, okay, to ensure that Germany cannot continue to grow. And so on April 6, 1917, all right, the United States will officially enter World War One. Now, really quick, take a second and answer practice question number 2. Now, World War One, okay, remember, as the war started, the United States did some things fairly quickly. All right, one, we initiated the Selective Service Act, which, remember, just gives us the draft. Okay, it allows us to bring in many, many men, okay, roughly 3 million men to go fight, okay, that the United States didn't have to begin with. All right, we start financing the war pretty heavily. Okay, we have increase in taxes. Okay, we start giving out bonds to the American people. Okay, all right, this allowed the American people to essentially invest in the U.S. government. Okay, and then hopefully after, right, once we won the war, okay, you would get your money back and plus interest. Now, We also started focusing a lot on conserving resources. Herbert Hoover leads the Food Administration Board, right? And his sole purpose was to ensure that we had food to send to our troops. Okay. And so he started asking people to plant victory gardens. Okay. That you would then donate the food to the military. Okay. He started calling for wheatless and meatless and porkless days, right? Trying to conserve, okay, as many resources and as much food as we could, okay, to send to Europe, right, to benefit our troops. Now, remember, all of this at this point in World War I was a voluntary action. Okay, people looked at it as your patriotic duty. Okay, it was something you were meant to do, okay, as an American citizen. Okay, right. This was just the expectation at this point in time. All right, so take a second and answer practice question number 3. Now, other things that started happening after the United States entered the war, remember, our workforce changes, okay, because the vast majority of men are now off to Europe, okay, to fight. Okay, we started seeing the workforce change. We started seeing more women and minorities start to enter factories and farms to help with wartime production. I remember for women, right, they get a reward because of this in the 19th Amendment. Okay, right, Woodrow Wilson gets the 19th Amendment passed that gives women suffrage, okay, because he sees what they did throughout the war. Okay. And then African Americans, we see a change in them through the Great Migration, where we see hundreds of thousands of African Americans leave the South and move north. I remember the push factors that they're getting away from were Jim Crow, segregation, racism, lynching, all these things that had taken over in the South. All right, and the pull factors that are pulling them north, right, job and economic opportunities. They have better chances at landing a good, safe employment in the North than they had in the South. Now, remember, this causes some issues, okay, as all these hundreds of thousands of African Americans are moving and moving into these new industrial cities like Chicago and St. Louis and Detroit, right, in terms of competition for jobs. Okay, and we know that that leads to some serious issues that start to pop up. Okay, and you can see this map and you'll see it again, right? The purple being where the African Americans started, and then the arrows kind of pointing to where a lot of them ended up. Okay. Now, also in World War I, we start to question civil rights and your civil liberties. Okay, up here you have your espionage and sedition acts. Okay, set punishments for people who were spying. Okay, or just in general hurt the war effort. Okay. And so what we start to see is that the government begins to limit people's First Amendment rights, right? People were calling for freedom of speech, right? That they should be able to say what they want when they want. But the government came back and said, actually, no, you can't. I remember we looked at a man by the name of Eugene Debs, okay, who tested this many times and will be imprisoned many times, okay, because of the things he says against the government and against the war effort in the United States. And then we have the Supreme Court case you had to know this go around, Schenck versus the United States. Okay, remember Charles Schenck was giving out anti-draft papers all across the United States, and he ends up getting arrested for it. And he starts calling for his First Amendment, that his civil rights are being taken away from him. And the government comes back and they say, look, when there is a clear and present danger, when national security is at risk, the government can limit your freedom of speech. Okay, and you see the question that came into place was national security versus individual liberties. Okay, the government had to ask, is giving you your civil rights more important than keeping the country safe? And per the government, they're going to keep the country safe every single time, even if that means taking your freedom of speech away during a time of war, right? And so you started seeing these propaganda posters that started to circulate in the United States. Hey, know your place, shut your face, right? And we know this is obviously Uncle Sam's hand over this man's mouth, right? Loose lips might sink ships. Okay, saying, look, if you know anything about the military or where our ships are, you need to keep your mouth shut. Okay, because it could be real lives, okay, on the line if you talk about it. Okay. All right, and take a second to answer practice question number 4. All right, and then finally, the ending of the war, you have the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, I remember with this, you have Wilson's 14 points. Okay, now remember with the Treaty of Versailles, we end up giving Germany the full blame. Okay, and they're forced to pay reparations, all of these war debts, okay, to Great Britain and France. Now, remember, we do not sign the Treaty of Versailles for several reasons. One, Wilson didn't want to blame anybody. Okay, he essentially wanted to let bygones be bygones and for everybody to just move on. Right. And again, that was an easy American perspective to have because we hadn't been fighting for the past 4 years, okay, like Germany and Great Britain had. Okay. Now, remember, one of the biggest aspect of Wilson's 14 points and the only point of the 14 points to be put into the Treaty of Versailles was the League of Nations, this peacekeeping organization that Wilson wanted to put together, that was meant to essentially prevent another world war from taking place. Now, remember, the United States refused to join because a lot of senators didn't feel like this was our place. Now that we'd entered World War I and we helped end it, okay, they said, look, we're done. All right, we're going to go back to the United States. We are going to be isolated, be neutral, okay, and not intervene in any other country's affairs. Okay, we didn't want to be pulled into any future wars. We wanted to be isolationists, and you can see it up here in this political cartoon that starts to get plastered across the United States and really the world, right? And you said this League of Nations bridge was designed by the President of the United States, right? Which that's the irony, okay, of the League of Nations is you have Belgium and France and England and Italy, right? Some of our biggest allies during the war, and now these countries that are coming together to ensure world peace, right? But you have the keystone, right? The stone that's going to hold everybody together, the United States of America, right, that didn't join, right? And what a lot of these countries ask, okay, the question that a lot of these countries ask is, their president is the one who brought this together, but they're not joining. Okay, but remember why? We didn't want to be pulled into any more issues or drama in Europe. That's what we were trying to avoid. Okay. All right, and then finally, answer practice question number 5. All right, and then once you get that question answered, okay, if you have any more questions, please let me know. Come to the review for Zero Block. Do your sketch notes. Okay, you got the 5 points for watching the video. But if you have any additional questions, please let me know as soon as